Usually, when you think about planting something, there's this built-in expectation of boundaries.
Right, yeah, it's a localized thing. Highly predictable.
Exactly. Like you plant an apple tree in an orchard, it grows apples, you eat the apples, and the tree just sort of stays exactly where you put it. It stays in its lane.
We definitely prefer our agriculture to be, you know, neatly categorized. Like food goes on the plate, nature stays out in the field.
But then you step into the world of this one specific grass, and suddenly, literally every single one of those boundaries just dissolves. I mean, we are looking at a botanical entity today that completely defies categorization.
Oh, absolutely.
It's in the drywall of your house. It's in the gas tank of your car. It's in the dry shampoo you use in the morning. It's sweetening the soda you drink at lunch. And it is literally the adhesive holding together the corrugated cardboard box that, just got delivered to your porch.
Yeah, it is the absolute definition of a biological and infrastructural shapeshifter.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are exploring the most misunderstood plant on Earth, maize, or, corn. And for you listening, our favorite learner, we're going to view this plant through a very specific, really fascinating conceptual lens today.
It's a great lens.
We're looking at corn as the ultimate code switcher. So think of it like a subpersonality. Let's call this personality Mac. And Mac is, playful but serious, sweet on the outside but kind of hiding a deep struggle.
Right, Mac refuses to be flattened.
Exactly. Capable of jumping from sacred, ancient, indigenous rituals directly into the heart of hypermodern industrial supply chains.
And I should say, the scope of what we are covering today is just massive. I mean, we are tracing a 9,000-year history that touches on foundational biology, global economics, some pretty severe ecological impacts, and a profound cultural symbolism that shapes, billions of lives.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Because to understand how corn became literally everything to everyone, we really have to figure out what it actually is on a cellular level.
Yeah, we have to start with the biology.
And more importantly, what humans forced it to become. Because this plant's dominance was not some botanical accident.
No, far from it. Though, before we get into the biology, we should probably address the name itself, because the terminology sort of sets the stage for how this plant is historically perceived, right?
Right.
So in the United States, we casually just call it corn. But globally and historically, maize is actually the much more precise term.
I always wondered about that. Why do we say corn when basically the rest of the world says maize?
Well, historically in English, the word corn simply referred to the dominant grain of any given region. So wheat was the corn of England, oats were the corn of Scotland.
Oh, wow. So it was just a generic term for grain.
Exactly. So when European colonists arrived in the Americas, they encountered this entirely new, dominant indigenous crop and simply called it Indian corn, which, eventually just got shortened to corn.
That makes so much sense.
But maize actually derives from the Taino word maize, which points directly to the specific crop that indigenous peoples of the Americas domesticated.
See, that distinction really matters because the history of this plant is, in a lot of ways, a history of misrecognition.
Yes, absolutely.
Like when European colonizers first encountered maize, they just saw a highly productive, useful food source, right?
All right.
But they completely flattened its identity. They stripped away the vast ecological knowledge and the spiritual systems attached to it.
Which brings us right back to that Mac lens you mentioned, that idea of radical authenticity versus being boxed into a stereotype.
Right.
Because Mac refuses to be reduced to a single, easily digestible category. And corn has suffered that exact same flattening. Modern society looks at a cornfield and just sees cheap calories or yellow kernels.
Right, but biologically, maize is this vast, complex family of colors, forms, and adaptations.
Definitely.
So let's get into that biology. We're talking about maize, which is part of the Poaceae family, the grass family.
Yeah.
And it's categorized as a warm season C4 photosynthetic annual crop. Now, I need you to break that down for me because C4 photosynthetic pathway sounds like a military explosive, not a plant trait. What does that actually mean?
I know, it sounds intense. But it is arguably the most important biological trait the plant possesses.
Okay.
So most plants on Earth, things like wheat, rice, trees, they use what's called the C3 photosynthetic pathway. They take in carbon dioxide and use this enzyme called rubisco to bind that carbon and turn it into sugars.
Seems straightforward enough.
It is, mostly. The problem with the C3 pathway is that rubisco is notoriously sloppy.
Wait, sloppy how?
Well, when a C3 plant gets too hot, it has to close the tiny pores on its leaves, the stomata, to prevent water from evaporating, right?
Okay, to save water.
Yeah. But when it closes those pores, carbon dioxide can't get in, and oxygen builds up inside the leaf. So Rubisco basically gets confused and starts binding with the oxygen instead of the carbon.
Oh, that sounds bad.
It's terrible for the plant. This process is called photorespiration, and it essentially wastes the plant's energy, literally suffocates the plant.
So standard plants essentially panic and shut down their own food production when the temperature spikes.
Exactly. But corn is a C4 plant.
Yep.
And C4 plants evolved this brilliant biological workaround.
Okay, what do they do?
They physically separate the carbon capture process from the sugar-making process into completely different types of cells.
Really?
Yeah. They use a much more efficient enzyme to grab carbon dioxide right at the surface, temporarily store it as a 4-carbon acid, hence the name C4, and then they pump that acid deeper inside the leaf into specialized bundle sheath cells where the Rubisco is waiting.
Okay, wow, so it's like a biological airlock?
Yes, that's a great way to put it.
Like, it captures the carbon at the door, seals it up, and securely transports it to the inner factory where the real work happens, totally away from all that dangerous oxygen buildup.
That is a phenomenal way to visualize it.
Mm.
And because of this airlock system, corn can keep its stomata partially closed, saving massive amounts of water, while still continuously pumping carbon into its internal factory.
So it just keeps working while other plants are shutting down?
Exactly. It's exceptionally efficient at using sunlight under high heat. It is basically a high-yield carbohydrate machine.
But the wild thing is, it didn't start out looking like a machine. Like, if we trace it back roughly 9,000 years to the central Balsas River Valley of Mexico, we find its wild ancestor,
Teosinte.
right, a grass called teosinte, specifically Zea maize subspecies parviglumis. And I've looked at the botanical drawings of teosinte, and it does not look like corn. I mean, it looks like a weed you'd hit with a string trimmer.
It really does. If you were walking past Teosinte 10,000 years ago, you would not look at it and think, oh, this is the future foundation of global agriculture.
Not at all.
Teosinte is bushy, has multiple branches, and the seeds are entirely different. They are tiny, hard, and encased in these incredibly tough fruit cases. And most importantly, the seeds naturally shatter.
Shatter, meaning they, like, explode.
In a botanical sense, yes. When the seeds mature, the structure holding them becomes brittle, and they literally disperse themselves. They drop to the ground or are carried off by animals.
Okay, so they scatter.
Right. Which is a brilliant survival mechanism for a wild plant. It ensures the next generation spreads out.
So teosinte seeds shatter, meaning it's like a grenade. It blows its own seeds across the field to reproduce without any help.
Exactly.
But modern maize is the exact opposite. It's like a locked safe. It has these massive ears, exposed kernels, and it is completely dependent on humans to survive. The seeds do not shatter.
This is the defining genetic shift. The trait is literally called non-shattering. If a modern ear of corn falls to the ground, the kernels are permanently stuck to the cob, tightly wrapped in a husk.
Right, they can't get out.
No. If left alone, they will either just rot in the field, or they'll all sprout simultaneously right on top of each other, compete for nutrients, and die. Maize literally cannot reproduce unless a human comes along with the combination to the safe, rips off the husk, pries the kernels off the cob, and plants them individually.
I am honestly stuck on the sheer scale of that genetic leap, because humans didn't just, stumble upon an ear of modern corn in the woods.
No, not at all.
This was a radical act of mutual domestication. Early indigenous farmers patiently engineered this plant over hundreds of generations, actively selecting for larger ears, softer kernels, and that non-shattering trait.
And biologists have actually pinpointed some of the specific mutations. For example, there's a single gene called TJ1, and it controls the formation of that hard fruit case in teosinte.
Okay.
A tiny mutation in that gene essentially opened the case up, exposing the soft kernel inside, which made it easier for humans to eat, but also made the plant totally vulnerable. The plant traded its botanical independence for human protection.
That completely upends the stereotype that ancient farming was somehow primitive or, accidental.
Oh, completely.
The engineering here is staggering. To go back to our code-switching Mac analogy, teosinte is kind of like an indie garage band trying to survive on its own. It's scrappy, it's independent, it books its own gigs.
Yeah, I like that.
But modern maize is an overproduced pop star. It has massive arena tour energy, it generates billions of dollars, but it literally cannot even plug in its own microphone without a crew of humans setting up the stage.
What's fascinating here is that because humans created this highly dependent pop star of a crop, They were then obligated to invent brilliant ecological systems to keep it thriving.
Right, because it can't survive on its own anymore.
Exactly. You can't just plant a highly demanding, genetically altered grass in the dirt and walk away.
You need a highly functional ecosystem to support the tour, which takes us into the original operating system of corn agriculture in Mesoamerica. Because these early farmers didn't have synthetic fertilizers, they didn't have steel plows, and they definitely didn't have chemical herbicides.
No, they relied on profound, highly localized ecological knowledge. And the most elegant and famous of these systems is the milpa, commonly known in North America as the Three Sisters.
The Three Sisters, yeah.
Right. It's a polyculture system, meaning growing multiple crops in the exact same space that combines maize, beans, and squash.
So how does that actually work in practice? Why those three specific plants together?
Well, it is agronomically brilliant. First, you plant the maize. As it grows, it provides a tall, sturdy, vertical structure. Then you plant the beans.
Okay.
And the beans use the maize stalk as a living trellis to climb up toward the sun. But the beans are doing something really crucial underground. Beans are legumes, and they have this symbiotic relationship with rhizobia bacteria in their root nodules.
And these bacteria pull nitrogen out of the air and fix it into the soil.
Precisely, which maize desperately needs. Corn is what agronomists call a heavy feeder. It requires massive amounts of nitrogen to build its tall stalks and protein-rich kernels. So the beans are essentially manufacturing fertilizer on-site for the corn.
That's incredible. And the squash.
Finally, you plant the squash. Squash plants grow really low to the ground and have these enormous broad leaves. These leaves act as a living mulch.
Oh, to shade the soil.
Exactly. They shade the soil, which prevents the hot sun from evaporating essential moisture, and they physically block competing weeds from getting enough light to grow.
It is a perfect closed-loop system. I mean, the Three Sisters is basically companion planting with a PhD and no student debt.
That's very true.
Everyone is pulling their weight. The corn is the scaffolding, the beans are the catering, and the squash is the security team keeping the weeds out.
And their engineering extended far beyond just the field. Indigenous peoples engaged in advanced landscape engineering. In the highlands, they built complex stone terraces to prevent soil erosion on steep slopes. They dug intricate irrigation canals.
Right.
But the absolute masterclass in ancient engineering was the Aztec Chinampas.
The artificial islands. Okay, you would tell me exactly how you build an island out of nothing just to grow corn.
The Chinampas were constructed in the shallow freshwater lakes of the Valley of Mexico. Farmers would mark out rectangular plots right in the water using stakes and woven reeds.
Okay, in the water.
Yes. Then they would dredge up the incredibly nutrient-rich mud and decaying vegetation from the bottom of the lake, and they'd pile it into the fenced area until it rose above the water level.
But wait, wouldn't the water just eventually wash all that mud away?
That's where the biological engineering comes in. To stabilize these raised beds, they planted a specific type of willow tree, the aquijote, along the edges.
Oh.
Yeah. The roots of the willow trees would grow rapidly down into the lake bed, acting as living retaining walls that locked the artificial island in place.
Wow.
Furthermore, because the beds were surrounded by water, the soil acted like a sponge. Capillary action pulled water up directly into the root zones of the maize plants. They rarely needed to water them manually, and the dredged lake mud provided this constant, renewable fertility.
They literally manufactured new earth. That is amazing. And what's wild is that the biology of the corn plant itself is what allowed them to continually improve these systems over time.
Yes, the reproductive anatomy of maize is highly unusual for grasses, and it's what made the plant so adaptable to human intervention.
Because the male and female parts are separated, right?
Right. Maize has both male and female flowers on the exact same plant, but they're physically separated by several feet.
The tassels and the silks?
Yes. The male flower is the tassel at the very top of the stalk, which produces millions of grains of pollen. The female flower is the ear, located lower down on the stalk. And those strands of silk sticking out of the top of the husk?
Yeah.
Every single individual silk is a biological tube connected to a single potential kernel, an ovary on the cob.
Wait. So for an ear of corn to develop properly, a microscopic grain of pollen has to fall off the top of the plant, catch the wind, land on one specific tiny thread of silk, and then travel all the way down that thread just to fertilize one kernel.
Yes. If a silk doesn't receive pollen, that specific kernel will not develop. You'll get a blank spot on the cob.
That's crazy.
And because maize relies on the wind for cross-pollination, and because the male and female parts are separated, early farmers could easily control the breeding. If they saw a plant with a trait they liked, say, drought resistance, they could physically take the pollen from that plant's tassel and manually dust it onto the silks of another desirable plant.
Which perfectly explains how we got such a massive diversity of corn. We didn't just get one type. We got dent corn, flint corn, flour corn, sweet corn, popcorn, waxy corn, and pod corn.
Exactly. They were selecting for very specific starch structures. Flour corn, for instance, has a very soft endosperm, making it super easy to grind by hand and define powder for dough. Popcorn, on the other hand, has a dense, hard, moisture-resistant outer hull.
And that hard hull is the whole trick, right? Because when
No.
you heat popcorn, the moisture trapped inside the kernel turns to steam. The pressure builds up to something crazy, like 135 pounds per square inch, until the hull finally just gives way, and the starchy inside explodes outward, cooks instantly, and forms that fluffy shape.
Right.
It's basically an edible pressure cooker.
It really is.
Yeah.
And the diversity of land races, these varieties, adapted to high altitudes, arid deserts, and tropical lowlands, exists entirely because generations of unnamed village farmers, grandmothers, and seed keepers acted as localized agronomists. They managed this complex ecological and genetic balance.
And this perfect, beautifully balanced system worked in the Americas for thousands of years. But then, we hit 1492, the Columbian Exchange begins, the crop goes global, spreading across oceans faster than almost any other food in history.
Yes, very rapidly.
But the software, the operating manual that made the crop safe and functional did not travel with the hardware.
Right. Maize was incredibly attractive to European colonizers and traders because it was highly productive, it grew quickly, and it could thrive in marginal climates where European staples like wheat repeatedly failed.
So it just took off everywhere.
Oh, everywhere. In upland China, the introduction of maize allowed populations to rapidly expand into steep, mountainous areas that previously couldn't support agriculture. In parts of Europe, particularly northern Italy, Romania, and the Balkans, it became the foundational staple of the peasantry. Think of regional dishes like polenta or malagil.
Oh, right. Polenta is corn.
Yes. And across sub-Saharan Africa, it was so deeply integrated that it birthed foundational daily foods like ugali, saza, and pap.
But there is a massive, really tragic catch to this global expansion. Because when the Europeans took the seeds from the Americas, they completely ignored the culinary science of the indigenous people.
They did.
They left behind a critical chemical process called nixtamalization. I want to dig into the chemistry here because it is just mind-blowing to me. How does a simple cooking technique alter the actual chemical safety of a plant?
It is arguably one of the most important yet globally underappreciated food technologies in human history. The first archaeological evidence of nixtamalization dates back thousands of years to ancient Maya contexts.
Okay, so it's ancient.
Very. The process involved taking dried maize kernels and steeping and cooking them in an alkaline solution.
Alkaline meaning something basic, like high on the pH scale. But
Yeah.
how did ancient people get an alkaline solution?
Traditionally, they mixed water with food-grade limestone, calcium hydroxide, or fine wood ash.
Just ash from the fire.
Exactly. And chemically, boiling the corn in this highly alkaline water does several miraculous things simultaneously. First, it breaks down the hemicellulose in the hard outer hull of the kernel, the pericarp.
Okay.
This makes the hull slip right off, making the corn infinitely easier to grind. Second, it alters the proteins, allowing the ground corn to form a cohesive dough masa so you can actually make tortillas and tamales that hold their shape.
But the nutritional change is the real magic trick, isn't it?
Yes, it absolutely is. Raw maize contains a form of vitamin B3, also known as niacin. But in raw maize, this niacin is chemically bound to large molecules, forming a complex called niacin. The human digestive system simply cannot break niacin down. So if you eat untreated corn, the niacin just passes right through you unabsorbed.
So you could eat thousands of calories of corn a day and literally still starve to death for lack of vitamins.
Exactly. But the alkaline solution in the nixtamalization process breaks that chemical bond. It frees the bound niacin, making it highly bioavailable for the human body to actually absorb.
Wow.
Additionally, if the alkaline agent used is limestone, the process infuses the corn with massive amounts of dietary calcium.
And the European colonizers just watched indigenous grandmothers at the grinding stone boiling corn in ash water and thought, yeah, we're going to skip that part. That looks like primitive witchcraft. Just give us the cheap calories.
Sadly, yes.
Yeah.
That cultural arrogance, the assumption that indigenous culinary practices held no real scientific value, caused a public health catastrophe that lasted for centuries.
Because the people eating it weren't getting the nutrients.
Right. When impoverished populations in Europe and later in the American South began relying on untreated maize as their primary monotonous caloric staple, they developed a horrifying nutritional disease called pellagra.
Because they weren't eating the diverse indigenous diet of beans, squash, and game meats alongside the corn to get their vitamins, they were just eating untreated cornmeal mush. What does pellagra actually do to the body?
So pellagra is basically characterized by the 4 Ds: dermatitis, diarrhea, dementia, and eventually death.
Oh my God.
It starts with severe sun-sensitive skin lesions, progresses into gastrointestinal collapse, and eventually destroys the nervous system, causing severe cognitive decline and paranoia.
That is terrifying.
And for decades, European and American doctors thought it was an infectious disease or a genetic defect of the poor. They completely missed that it was an easily preventable nutritional deficiency caused by their own failure to learn from the people who domesticated the crop.
It perfectly illustrates that MAC theme we talked about. Colonizers boxed corn into a superficial category. They just saw a carbohydrate. They ignored the operating manual, flattened the plant's identity, and suffered a massive localized health crisis because of it.
And as corn continued its global spread, that same scalability and caloric density that caused the pellagra epidemic made the crop a foundational tool for empires. It literally became the logistics of colonialism and slavery.
Here's where it gets really interesting, but also where the history of the crop gets incredibly dark. Because corn wasn't just a food anymore, it was fuel. It fed colonial armies marching across continents, it sustained brutal mining operations, and horrifically, it was used to provision slave ships during the Middle Passage across the Atlantic.
Yes, in the Americas, maize was entirely intertwined with the plantation economy. The wealthy planters focused their best land and resources on highly profitable cash crops: sugar, cotton, tobacco, and rice.
Right, the moneymakers.
But to keep that forced labor system running, they needed cheap, easily stored calories. Corn, usually issued alongside salted pork, became the primary weekly ration for enslaved people.
And the historical records talk about enslaved people being forced to grow their own food in what they called provision grounds.
Yes, these were often small, really marginal plots of land on the edges of the plantation. Enslaved people were expected to work these plots on their rare time off, usually Sundays or late at night, to supplement the intentionally meager rations provided by the enslavers.
That's just incredibly brutal.
It was. It was a tiny sliver of agricultural autonomy, but it was autonomy strictly contained within a system of extreme violent bondage.
But here is where the resilience of the human spirit completely defies the cruelty of the system. Within that horror, enslaved Africans and their descendants took those meager corn rations and, through sheer culinary genius, birthed an entirely new cuisine out of survival.
We really see the emergence of enduring foodways.
Yeah.
Cornbread, grits, hominy, hoe cakes, hush puppies. These weren't just recipes, they were acts of endurance. They emerged from a complex intersection of indigenous American plant knowledge, African culinary memory and cooking techniques, and European colonial encounters.
It goes right back to that album, Reflection on Turning Pain into Purpose. When people today talk about cornbread or grits having like rustic Southern charm, they are often missing the point completely.
Absolutely.
This cuisine was forged under immense pressure. It is profound cultural memory. It's the act of making something warm, sustaining, and culturally defining out of a system that was intentionally designed to break you.
And we really must recognize the immense gendered physical labor embedded in this survival. In maize-dependent societies stretching all the way from ancient Mesoamerica to the plantation South, women carried the unheralded, physically punishing daily toll of processing the corn.
Tell me about that physical process, because before mechanized mills, how hard was it to process corn every single day?
It was grueling. I mean, in Mesoamerica, women spent hours every single day kneeling over a metai, which is a volcanic stone grinding slab. They had to shell the corn by hand, boil it for nixtamalization, let it steep overnight, wash off the alkaline solution, and then use a stone roller, called a mano, to physically crush the wet kernels into a smooth masa dough.
Just manually crushing wet corn against a rock?
Yes. And only then could they begin the labor of patting out and cooking tortillas. In the American South, women were similarly burdened with shelling, pounding, and standing over hot fires, stirring thick kettles of grits or porridge.
Wow.
The entire social fabric and caloric survival of these civilizations depended entirely on women's technical skill, wrist strength, and sheer endurance.
The backbone of the entire civilization was literally their wrists.
Yes.
But as this crop moves into the 19th and 20th centuries, it encounters a force that completely removes the stone grinder. The Industrial Revolution arrives, and this is where corn stops being just a food and morphs into a microscopic manufacturing plant.
Mechanization changes everything. The introduction of the steel plow allows farmers to rip up the deep-rooted sod of the American Midwest. Then you get mechanical planters, mechanical harvesters, the construction of massive grain elevators, and the expansion of the railroad networks. Suddenly, you do not need a village of people to harvest and process a field of corn. You need a combine and a train.
But the machinery wasn't the biggest change, was it? The biggest change happened inside the seed itself, the invention of hybrid corn.
This was a total watershed moment in agricultural history. Plant geneticists figured out that if you take two distinct, highly inbred lines of corn plants that have been bred with themselves until they are weak and genetically uniform and you cross-pollinate them, the resulting offspring experience something called hybrid vigor.
Hybrid vigor, meaning the offspring suddenly become superplants.
Exactly. The hybrid offspring explode with massive yields, incredible uniformity, and stalk strength. They all grow to the exact same height and mature on the exact same day, which is absolutely perfect for mechanical harvesting.
That sounds like a farmer's dream.
It does, but there's a biological catch that completely altered the economics of farming.
Because you can't save the seeds anymore.
Right. The seeds produced by those robust hybrid plants do not breed true. If a farmer saves the kernels from a hybrid crop and plants them the next year, the genetics scramble.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the resulting plants will be highly uneven and the yield will plummet dramatically.
So, in one technological leap, the power of the seed was completely stripped away from the farmer and handed directly to corporate seed breeders. A farmer could no longer rely on the seed they grew. They were financially locked into buying new hybrid seed every single spring.
And because these hybrid seeds were expensive, farmers had to maximize their yields just to pay off their debt. This flooded the market with uniform, cheap corn. And when you have an ocean of cheap corn, industrialists start looking for ways to use it beyond just making cornbread. They figured out how to literally dismantle the kernel.
How do you dismantle a piece of corn, like physically?
Through a massive industrial process called wet milling. It is essentially taking the corn apart on a molecular level.
Okay, walk me through it.
First, they steep the raw kernels in huge tanks of water mixed with sulfur dioxide for nearly 2 days.
Wait, sulfur dioxide? Like an acid?
Yes, this sulfurous acid weakens the physical bonds between the protein and the starch. Then, they run the softened kernels through coarse grinders that tear the kernel open without crushing the germ inside.
The germ being the little embryo at the center of the kernel that contains all the oil?
Exactly. Because the germ is full of oil, it's lighter than the rest of the kernel. So they put the ground slurry into spinning centrifuges called hydrocyclones.
Wow, okay.
The oil-rich germ floats to the top and is skimmed off to make corn oil. What's left is a mixture of starch, protein, and fiber. They filter out the fiber to be sold as animal feed. Finally, they use high-speed centrifuges to separate the heavier starch from the lighter protein, which is called corn gluten.
So you start with a yellow piece of corn, and you end up with separated vats of pure oil, pure protein, pure fiber, and pure starch.
Exactly.
Once you do that, it is no longer an agricultural product, it is an industrial feedstock.
And the scale of this feedstock is staggering. Today, over 95% of the feed grain produced in the United States is corn. Yes, it is the absolute engine of the entire industrialized meat, poultry, and dairy system. But even beyond livestock feed, almost 60% of all domestically used U.S. corn goes into food processing, seed, and industrial manufacturing.
And the biggest chunk of that industrial pie is fuel ethanol. I really want to understand the mechanism here. How do we get from a pile of white cornstarch to liquid fuel that I can pump into my car?
It actually relies on ancient biological technology. Fermentation.
Like making beer.
Exactly like that.
Huh.
In the ethanol plant, they take that pure cornstarch and add specialized enzymes. These enzymes act like molecular fizzers, snipping the complex starch molecules down into simple sugars, primarily glucose.
Okay.
Then they introduce yeast. The yeast eats the glucose and produces two byproducts, carbon monoxide and ethyl alcohol. They distill that alcohol to purify it, and boom, you have fuel-grade ethanol.
But the industrial process wastes nothing. Even when they make fuel, there are leftovers, right?
Yes, tons of it. A typical bushel of corn yields roughly 2.7 gallons of ethanol. But the yeast doesn't eat the protein or the fat that remained in the mash.
Right, they just want the sugar.
Exactly. So after distillation, the plant dries out the leftover solids. This creates a product called distiller's dried grains with solubles, or DDGS.
50GS.
Yes. It is roughly 17.5 pounds of highly concentrated protein feed per bushel, which is immediately sold back to cattle feedlots. The processing plant leaves literally no molecule behind.
And the starch that they don't ferment into gasoline, where does that go? Because you mentioned it is literally in everything.
Through chemical and enzymatic manipulation, that pure starch becomes almost anything. It is transformed into polylactic acid, or PLA.
Uh-huh.
Through bacterial fermentation, lactic acid is produced and then polymerized into a biodegradable plastic.
Like the clear plastic cups at coffee shops.
Yes, used for compostable coffee cups, food packaging, and even the filament used in 3D printers.
Wait, really? So my 3D printer is literally melting and extruding corn?
Yes, and it's in the cardboard box that the 3D printer was delivered in too.
No way.
The corrugating industry uses massive amounts of modified cornstarch as the primary adhesive to glue the fluted layers of cardboard together. It's used as a binding agent in the manufacturing of gypsum drywall. The pharmaceutical industry uses specialized corn syrups as the nutrient-rich fermentation substrate to grow the bacteria that produce our antibiotics and synthetic vitamins.
This is insane.
Oh, and if you spray dry shampoo in your hair to absorb oil, check the ingredients. It is very likely modified cornstarch.
And we haven't even talked about the grocery store. High fructose corn syrup.
The defining ingredient of modern processed food. In the 1970s, Japanese scientists perfected a method using enzymes to convert the glucose in corn syrup into fructose, which is much, much sweeter.
Right.
It gave the food and beverage industry an incredibly cheap, liquid, highly stable sweetener. It completely reshaped the modern palate.
Corn is basically out here getting monetized like a superhero cinematic universe. I mean, it left the farm in muddy work boots and came back wearing a luxury hoodie. It feeds the cow. It sweetens the soda you drink with the burger. It fuels the delivery truck that brought the beef to the restaurant. It glues together the cardboard box your takeout came in, and it keeps your hair looking fresh while you eat it.
It really does.
It is the invisible architecture of modern life.
Which naturally leads us to ask, who is profiting from this invisible abundance? Because if corn is in everything, the financial systems built around it have to be intensely powerful.
That is the core paradox of the value chain, right?
Right.
We have a crop that is insanely productive. There are billions of dollars being generated by these chemical spin-offs. So why are so many of the actual farmers who grow the corn trapped in cycles of crippling debt?
Because of how the risk is distributed versus how the margins are captured. The modern corn farmer carries almost all the upfront risk.
How so?
Every spring, they have to take out massive loans to buy the patented hybrid or genetically modified seeds, the synthetic nitrogen fertilizer, the chemical herbicides, the diesel fuel, the heavy equipment, and the land rent.
Wow, that's a lot of overhead.
And they also carry 100% of the weather risk. If a Derecho windstorm flattens the field or a severe drought hits during pollination, the farmer takes the entire financial hit.
So the farmer spends millions just for the privilege of planting the seed, basically hoping the weather cooperates. So who captures the profit?
The downstream players, the multinational grain traders, the ethanol refineries, the corporate meat packers, and the retail food brands. They are buying a heavily subsidized, artificially cheap raw material, the raw corn kernel, and converting it into high-margin, value-added products like meat, fuel, and bioplastics.
And the price of that raw kernel isn't even decided by the farmer or the local buyer, is it? It's decided by financial markets.
Yes. The pricing of corn is determined by global commodity markets, most notably the Chicago Board of Trade, which is now part of the CME Group. In these markets, corn is traded as futures contracts.
How does a futures contract actually work in this context?
Well, a futures contract is a legally binding agreement to buy or sell a specific quantity of corn at a predetermined price on a specific date in the future.
Okay.
Originally, this was designed as a brilliant risk management tool. A farmer could sell a futures contract in the spring to lock in a guaranteed price for their harvest in the fall, protecting themselves if prices crashed. A cereal company could buy a contract to lock in their ingredient costs. This is called hedging.
But I'm guessing the people trading corn today aren't actually cereal companies and farmers?
Exactly. The vast majority of market participants today are speculators, hedge funds, algorithms, and financial institutions. They have absolutely no intention of ever taking physical delivery of a train car full of corn. They are simply betting on the price movement.
They're literally trading the idea of corn.
This completely detaches the physical grain from the financial instrument. And it creates a brutal reality. I mean, a localized crop failure in a rural village due to drought is devastating for the people living there. But for a speculator sitting at a terminal in Chicago, that exact same drought causes a spike in volatility that they can highly profit from. Corn is no longer a plant. It is a volatile number flashing on a screen.
And on a global scale, that volatile number dominates international trade. The export market is heavily concentrated in the hands of a few massive players, the US, Brazil, and Argentina, and they're selling to major importers like China, who buys millions of tons strictly to feed their expanding livestock industry, and Mexico. Which brings us to a major geopolitical conflict happening right now. We need to look at the US-Mexico GMO dispute.
Yes. This is a complex, ongoing legal battle under the USMCA, the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement on Trade. In late 2024, a USMCA dispute panel ruled against Mexico's restrictions on importing genetically modified corn. However, following that ruling, Mexico's lower house pushed forward with a constitutional reform aiming to permanently ban the planting of genetically modified corn within their borders to protect native varieties.
So you have two completely different paradigms colliding in international court here. And just reporting neutrally on the sources on the U.S. side, you have the government and biotech corporations pointing to international trade law.
Right.
They argue that GMO corn, specifically butt corn, which is genetically engineered to produce a protein that kills specific pests, has been rigorously tested and deemed scientifically safe for decades. They view Mexico's restrictions as an illegal barrier to market access that violates the USMCA agreement and threatens billions of dollars in U.S. agricultural exports.
And then, on the Mexican side, the government and food sovereignty advocates argue this isn't just about a bulk commodity. They are citing the precautionary principle regarding biodiversity. Mexico is the genetic center of origin for maize. There are dozens of native landraces, ancient localized varieties of corn still being grown by smallholder farmers. They fear that importing viable GMO seeds could lead to accidental cross-pollination.
So the transgenic traits from the American industrial corn could literally bleed into the ancient Mexican landraces.
Exactly. They argue for the sovereign right to protect their botanical heritage and the deep cultural identity tied to their ancestral crop from irreversible genetic contamination.
It perfectly encapsulates everything we've been talking about. To the American export market, corn is a standardized, bulk global commodity governed by free trade agreements. To Mexico, corn is constitutional memory, the foundation of their gastronomy, and sovereign biological heritage. It is two completely different definitions of the exact same plant.
And the pressure of that global demand, the relentless push from the export markets for higher yields and greater volume, has forced the plant to do entirely too much.
Right.
We have built an industrial system that carries a massive, terrifying ecological tab. Let's look at the ecological ledger.
Okay, let's get into it. We mentioned earlier that corn is a heavy feeder. In the ancient Three Sisters system, the beans provided the nitrogen. But in modern industrial monocultures, where you plant millions of acres of nothing but corn, how does the plant get its food?
Through the Haber-Bosch process.
The Haber-Bosch process, what is that?
This is an industrial chemical process invented in the early 20th century that synthesizes ammonia from atmospheric nitrogen using extreme heat and pressure. It allows chemical companies to manufacture massive amounts of synthetic nitrogen fertilizer.
Oh, wow.
Modern industrial corn relies on millions of tons of this synthetic fertilizer being sprayed or injected into the soil every spring.
But the corn can't possibly absorb all of it, right?
It doesn't, and that is the core of the ecological crisis. When synthetic nitrogen is applied, a significant portion of it isn't taken up by the plant's roots. It volatilizes, meaning it evaporates into the atmosphere as nitrous oxide.
Nitric oxide.
Yes, nitrous oxide is a greenhouse gas that is roughly 300 times more potent at trapping heat than carbon dioxide.
300 times. And what about the nitrogen that stays in the ground?
It leaches. Nitrogen is highly soluble in water. When it rains, the excess fertilizer washes out of the topsoil into the drainage tiles, into the local creeks, and eventually into major river systems. The nitrogen runoff from the entire U.S. Corn Belt flows straight down the Mississippi River and empties into the Gulf of Mexico.
And that causes the dead zone. But how does fertilizer actually kill the ocean? I mean, I would think it would make sea plants grow.
It does make them grow, and that is the exact problem.
Wait.
Yeah. The massive influx of nitrogen causes explosive, unnatural blooms of microscopic algae. When those massive algae blooms eventually die, they sink to the bottom of the ocean.
Oh, I see where this is going.
The bacteria that decompose the dead algae consume enormous amounts of dissolved oxygen from the water. This process, called eutrophication, drops the oxygen levels so low that marine life literally suffocates. It creates a hypostic dead zone the size of New Jersey where fish and shrimp simply cannot survive.
So we are basically trading marine life in the Gulf of Mexico for high fructose corn syrup in the Midwest. And it's not just the water quality, it's the sheer volume of water being consumed.
Corn is incredibly thirsty, particularly during its reproductive phase. If a corn plant doesn't get sufficient water during the specific 2-week window when it is tasseling and silking, the pollen cannot travel down the silk tube and the yield will collapse.
So they have to water it constantly.
Yes, in dry regions like the Great Plains, farmers rely heavily on irrigation. They are pumping water out of ancient underground aquifers, like the Ogala Aquifer, at a rate vastly faster than rainfall can replenish them. We are literally mining fossil water to grow temporary feed grain.
And globally, the economic demand for corn is physically altering the face of the planet. I was reading about what is happening in Brazil with deforestation.
Yes, the expansion of the agricultural frontier in Brazil, specifically in the Cerrado savanna and the Amazon basin, is heavily driven by corn and soy. They use a system called safrinha, which means little harvest in Portuguese.
How does the safrinha work?
It is a double cropping system. Farmers clear new land to plant soybeans in the summer. The moment the soybeans are harvested, they immediately plant a second crop of corn, the safrinha, on the exact same land, aiming to harvest it before the dry season hits.
2 crops a year.
Because they can get 2 massive cash crops off the same piece of land in a single year, the financial incentive to clear-cut, pristine, biodiverse forests and savannas becomes overwhelming. The soybeans open the frontier, and the safrinha corn pays the heavy equipment bills to keep cutting deeper into the forest.
It's exhausting just trying to comprehend the scale. I mean, we have a crop that is incredibly vulnerable to fungal diseases. It is vulnerable to mycotoxins, like aflatoxins, which are highly toxic molds that can poison the grain if it's stored improperly.
Yeah.
And on top of all of this, it is uniquely vulnerable to climate change. Because if that tiny 2-week pollination window gets hit with a severe heat dome, which is happening more and more often, the pollen dies before it fertilizes the ear.
Which presents a brutal, ironic boomerang effect.
It's the ultimate tragic irony. Climate change is making corn significantly harder to grow reliably. Yet, the massive industrial mechanisms required to grow that corn, the synthetic nitrogen production, the nitrous oxide emissions, the deforestation, are massive contributors to the very greenhouse gas emissions causing the climate change in the first place. Industrial agriculture is throwing a boomerang and getting hit in the back of the head.
But it is crucial to remember, the plant itself is not the villain here.
No, of course not.
maize is just doing what humans bred it to do. The industrial monoculture system is the villain. We took one highly adaptable, brilliant grass, loaded the entire weight of human civilization's food, fuel, and industrial needs onto its stalk, and demanded it perform flawlessly at maximum yield every single season.
Yeah.
We essentially put civilization on a group project and forced corn to do all the research, write the entire paper, make the slides, and handle all the emotional labor.
It is burning out. So what does this all mean? How do we fix it? Is there a way to grow this plant without strip mining the soil's fertility?
There are clear, proven solutions within the realm of regenerative agriculture. It requires integrating ecological principles back into the farm. That means utilizing cover crops in the winter so the soil is never left bare to erode. It means returning to diverse multi-year crop rotations instead of just planting corn on top of corn every year.
I was looking at the data from the sources on a specific solution called prairie strips. It seems incredibly simple but highly effective.
It is remarkably effective. A prairie strip involves taking just a tiny fraction of a row crop field, maybe 10%, and strategically planting native, deep-rooted prairie grasses and wildflowers directly amidst or along the edges of the corn.
And the research shows that just by adding a small strip of native plants, it reduces water runoff by 37%.
Yes.
It retains 20 times more soil, preventing the topsoil from washing into the rivers, and it boosts pollinator abundance by 3.5 times.
Because the deep, dense root systems of the prairie plants act like a physical and biological sponge. They slow down the water, trap the nitrogen before it can reach the local creeks, and provide habitat for beneficial insects. It proves unequivocally that a cornfield does not have to be a biological desert. We can still achieve high yields while honoring the ecological limits of the soil.
But to actually implement those solutions, to find the cultural will to fix a broken industrial system, we really have to reconnect with the plant on a deeper level. We have to remember what corn actually means to humanity on a spiritual level. Let's look at the soul of the crop.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, for thousands of years, corn was never just a commodity or a calculation of calories. In Indigenous American cosmologies, maize is viewed as an ancestor. It is a deity. It is a sacred covenant between humans and the earth.
I think about the Popol Vuh, the foundational creation narrative of the Maya people.
In the Popol Vuh, the creator gods attempt several times to fashion the first humans. They try mud, but it crumbles. They try wood, but the wooden people have no soul or memory. Finally, they grind white and yellow corn into masa, and from that corn dough, they shape the flesh of the first four true humans. The Maya people are literally, cosmologically, made of corn. Planting the seed is not an economic transaction. It is a ritual act that connects the soil, the rain, the venerated ancestors, and the future generations.
And we see that profound spiritual connection in North America, too, with the green corn ceremony, often called the busk, practiced by indigenous peoples of the southeastern United States.
Yes, the green corn ceremony is deeply symbolic. It happens in late summer when the first ears of the new corn crop become edible. But it is not merely a harvest festival. It is a profound spiritual and moral reset for the entire society.
How so?
It involves days of fasting, physical and spiritual purification, the absolute forgiveness of all community grievances and minor crimes, and the extinguishing of all old fires. Only after the community has been morally renewed and a brand new sacred fire is lit are they allowed to eat the first ripened corn. The society literally rebuilds its social fabric around the maturation of the crop.
It makes complete sense when you look at the biology of the plant. A dry, seemingly dead seed is buried in the dark, cold earth. A fragile green shoot resurrects from the dirt, reaches up toward the sun, produces life-sustaining food, dries out, dies, and returns its seed to the earth to begin the cycle all over again. It is the story of life, death, and resurrection made physically manifest in a stalk of grass.
And even if you step outside of those deeply religious contexts, the modern, everyday folk meaning and comfort of corn remains staggering.
Think about the Mitchell Corn Palace in South Dakota. It is a massive building, literally covered in huge, intricate murals made entirely out of different colored ears of corn. It is civic theater. Or think about the emotional infrastructure of our food. The hours spent gathering around a table as a family, gossiping and talking during tamale making. The nostalgic smell of hot buttered popcorn in a dark movie theater. The absolute, unmatched comfort of a fresh, warm tortilla.
It grounds us in our humanity. And as we conclude with the Mac lens we introduced at the beginning, this is what radical authenticity looks like for Zia maize. It is funny and sacred, sweet and deeply scarred, incredibly common and entirely profound. It is the comforting smell of a grandmother's cornbread, and it is the eerie, dry rustle of massive stalks in the wind.
Cornfields are beautiful, but they can be incredibly eerie. Anyone who has stood near tall corn at night when the wind hits the dry leaves knows it can go from a pastoral summer evening to a horror film loading screen very quickly.
Because it contains multitudes. It code switches across every aspect of our lives.
Right.
It hides the brutal pain of its industrial exploitation beneath the nostalgic sweetness of a summer cookout. But when it is restored to its full context, when we actually honor the ancient seed keepers, the indigenous culinary science, the enduring black food waste foraged in survival, and the biological limits of the soil corn becomes its most authentic self, it stops being a commodity and becomes a companion again.
We have taken an absolutely massive journey today on this deep dive. From a wild, scrappy Mexican grass called teosinte that acted like a botanical grenade, carefully coaxed into existence by ancient hands, to the undisputed operating system of the modern world. Corn built empires, it survived the horrors of colonialism, it fueled the Industrial Revolution, and right now, it is quietly running our global economy from inside the cardboard boxes on our porches.
It serves as a perfect mirror of human civilization. It reflects our sheer genius in domestication, engineering, and survival. But it also unflinchingly reflects our deepest flaws, our tendency toward extraction, our reliance on monoculture, and our relentless, dangerous temptation to take complex living relationships and reduce them to standardized financial commodities.
So I want to leave you, our learner, with a final thought to chew on today. We learned today that humans and maize completely co-evolved. We made corn into what it is, and in a very literal, physical way, corn made us. Our bodies, our massive cities, our complex global economies are entirely built out of its captured carbon. But as we look forward, as we move into an era of lab-grown food, synthetic biology, and AI-driven soil-free vertical farming, what happens to the human soul when we finally sever that 9,000-year partnership?
That is a big question.
If we completely uncouple our survival from the dirt, from the rain, and from the stock of the biological companion that taught us how to build a civilization in the first place, do we lose the fundamental grounding that kept us human?
It is a profound, slightly unsettling question to carry forward. The massive, mechanized architecture of our modern food system is muddy and complex, but the history of this incredible crop remains deeply rooted in the soil.
Keep questioning the systems around you. Keep unpacking the hidden histories of the things you see every day. And keep diving deep. Until next time.